Hello there, I'm Brian LaRosa, and this is LaRosa's Trains. Ever since the early 1900s, toy trains have been a very popular hobby in the United States. They come in many different scales, types, and styles. Just as real trains evolve over the years, so do their toy counterparts, from the so-called tinplate trains of the pre-World War II period to the prototypical scale models of the 21st century. While most of today's products include more realistic details and digital sounds, as well as more innovative high-tech features, some others are instead replicas of older toys from the past. This is called a reproduction, which is basically a carbon copy of a train item that was last made a long time ago, primarily from the pre-war era or the post-war era. As many of you already know, these periods were respectively before and after the US military deployment into the Second World War. During this conflict, many toy companies were restricted to manufacturing essential supplies to our nation's armed forces. Since the late 1960s, some toy train brands decided to make reproductions of vintage items, many of which presumably come from all original toolings. In recent years, some have the same mechanical components as in their original counterparts, while others are equipped with contemporary features such as pre-recorded CD quality sounds and command control. Before I get to the benefits of reproductions, I do have to point out a few controversies from some hobbyists. First of all, some of the old-timers tend to feel overwhelmed by a large number of features on many recent model trains, including reproductions. It is understandable that many fathers, grandfathers, and even great-grandfathers can have a deep nostalgia for those toys they used to play with when they were kids. That also applies to transformers that control the trains with their old-school throttle handles, a sharp contrast to a wireless handheld remote, and later a smartphone. As of 2024, a lot of older hobbyists were born and raised during the post-war years, or to a lesser extent, the pre-war years. Secondly, most of the newer model trains we buy have been made in China, Vietnam, and a few other countries of the Far East. Many customers often complain about the quality issues with products manufactured there compared to the United States. Well, even American factories can have their own problems from time to time. Just because so many things are made in China these days doesn't always mean that they're terrible. And when it comes to making mistakes at a factory, they're not limited to Asia. They can happen anywhere in the world, including America. If an error occurs in the product and cannot be successfully troubleshooted by a consumer, this could be a defect. There should be no less than a 90% chance of having your item fixed or replaced by a fresh new copy at no cost, regardless of where it was made. And hopefully, you'll feel happier and have a better experience of interacting with customer service in this specialized hobby. Many of us know that China provides cheaper labor than the United States, but most train companies, such as Lionel and MTH, have been very well respected for a long time in terms of quality control. They're not like some multi-billion-dollar corporations who don't seem to care. They do listen to customers, and that's something we shouldn't feel bad about. Lastly, some people fear that reproductions could sabotage the values of the originals. Could newer versions cause the prices of the older ones to go up? Well, it depends on whom you're speaking to. But even without reproductions, the values of originals may still increase, in part due to inflation, and they can be more expensive and harder to find if they're in very good shape. While these modern replicas do have their own values, they're not really intended to upset the spirit of collecting trains. The MTH Tinplate line, for example, has no responsibility for affecting the prices of vintage trains, and I agree with that belief stated by Mike Wolf, founder of the company. It's only up to whoever sells originals, often for large amounts of money. Despite all this criticism, I still think making toy train reproductions is a good thing. Don't get me wrong. Here are the benefits. The purpose of these products is to recreate what toy trains used to look like back in the day. They are sort of like the real-life replicas of 19th century steam locomotives, such as George Stephenson's Rocket from England and the Tom Thumb from America. They were built for the same reason, to represent what railways were like in the early to mid-1800s. Toy train reproductions are generally easier to find than their original versions, especially those that are based on some of the most highly sought-after trains in the hobby. They are also usually more affordable, though they're still not cheap. Depending on the type of product, they may cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars less than the current values of older trains in their best conditions. Of course, reproductions look naturally brand new, as if they were built during the pre-war or post-war periods, giving a shiny and clean appearance instead of a dirty, grimy, worn-out condition. Most importantly, they can have the most up-to-date electronics that are often more reliable and longer-lasting than the old-fashioned mechanical parts, such as AC motors and reverse units, or E-units. Regardless of those differences, virtually all reproductions, including those equipped with command control, can be operated with a conventional transformer. This allows a hobbyist to appreciate not only the looks of an old train, but also the way it runs before computerized electronics were applied to model railroading. If I were to run a command-equipped reproduction almost exactly like an older toy, I would turn off the sounds and smoke, and then program it to conventional mode. It may not produce the sound of growling AC motors or the smell of ozone, but the differences are pretty subtle. Even some customers who do have their own original trains might be interested in buying reproductions, which means they would keep the former on the shelves for display while enjoying the operation of the latter. I am happy to say that I met a lot of older guys who are not afraid of new technology whatsoever, although I sometimes help them access some advanced features on their smartphones or tablets. Other reproductions are even based on several products that were announced in the catalog but never made in the years before or after the war. Not to mention a single 1920s prototype locomotive that never went into full production up until the 21st century. More info about it will be covered later. With all the benefits being explained, reproductions are designed to encourage customers, especially younger generations, to appreciate the old days of toy trains that substantially contrast with the intricately detailed scale models of today and tomorrow. In other words, it can be argued that if it wasn't for the existence of toy-looking tinplate trains of the pre-war era, there probably wouldn't be any of the realistic and prototypical ones. The former is considered to be a stepping stone to the latter, and Lionel is a perfect example of those technological changes. I'll explain more about it later in this video. By the way, reproductions are not limited to the trains themselves. There have also been reissues of some of the greatest accessories, like the Hellgate Bridge, the magnetic crane, the log loader, etc. Let's look at some of the most notable types of pre-war and post-war reproductions. But before I get to that, I have a disclaimer. There are a couple of exclusions. One, some of the modern-era Lionel products from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s appear to come from genuine post-war toolings, but they're not considered to be marketed as reproductions. And two, some of the more recent O-scale trains equipped with Lionel's legacy system are part of the pre-war inspired and post-war inspired sets. These are, of course, not carbon copies of toy trains from either era. They're just simply more detailed O-scale models painted in fantasy schemes inspired by older Lionel products. However, on the traditional side of the hobby, some of the post-war inspired locomotives, like the F3 diesel, do indeed come from all original tooling, and also include a few classic electrical components such as pull-more motors and magnet traction. Other post-war inspired products include some freight cars that are part of the Made in the USA series. I'm not sure whether these come from toolings of such era or if they're just all new. My guess would be the latter. If anybody has additional info, please tell me in the comments below. Obviously, I'm not going to mention every single pre-war and post-war reproduction in this video, but I will mention some of the most definitive examples. With the disclaimer out of the way, we are ready to go over several categories of toy train reproductions. Let's start with the pre-war era. In 1901, about a year after the birth of the Lionel Manufacturing Company, Joshua Lionel Cowan, aged in his 20s, introduced the company's first product line of toy trains, including motorized gondolas, electrics, and trolleys. They were initially intended to run on a two-rail track system, measuring 2 7/8 inches wide, and to be powered by wet cell or dry cell batteries. 5 years later, Lionel built its first steam locomotive, but made a substantial change to its track design. The result was the more familiar 2 1/8 inch gauge three-rail track called standard gauge. Other toy companies, such as American Flyer and Ives, would later produce their own similar-sized trains to run on standard gauge track. Moving into the 1910s, the smaller O-gauge trains were invented and became more affordable for people on a budget and friendlier to tight spaces in small houses. For that reason, standard gauge trains were eventually discontinued by the early 40s, although some of the lesser-known companies, such as McCoy and John A. Daniel Railway Lines, manufactured some of the more realistic-looking trains, rather than tinplate, for that same gauge during the post-war and modern years. Interestingly, Lionel reintroduced its own standard gauge line in 2002 by making a couple of steam passenger sets, the New York Central Commodore Vanderbilt and the Milwaukee Road Hiawatha, both of which were equipped with rail sounds and Trainmaster Command Control, or TMCC. Instead of having a tinplate look, the sets look more realistically detailed, including the interiors of the passenger cars, which used to be the hallmark of some pre-war standard gauge coaches. While these modern products look really nice, let's go back to the tinplate trains. In 1971, Jerry Williams established his own toy train business to manufacture standard gauge reproductions in the form of pre-war Lionel and Ives. Because of those products, the company was initially named Williams Reproductions. 2 years later, Mike Wolf, at the age of 12, became an employee for Jerry and helped with assembling the trains. A few other modern businesses, like T Reproductions, have built replicas of these vintage toys. In 1980, Mike started his mail order business of what became Mike's Train House, later known as MTH Electric Trains. He then purchased the pre-war tooling from Williams Electric Trains, who gave up the reproduction line. From that point on, the company began manufacturing exclusively O-gauge products. In fact, I did a video covering the history of MTH a few years ago, and it's still available on my YouTube channel if you want to learn more. In 1985, MTH contracted with Sam Hongsa to build the tinplate reproductions in South Korea. Within the next couple of years, though, the young company ceased production of its own trains in favor of subcontracting with other brands. The initial approach was the Lionel Classics line, the first formal relationship between MTH and Lionel Trains Incorporated. The former manufactured the tinplate items, while the latter marketed them in its catalog. They were all packed in the red boxes with the Classics logo on them. Since there was no command control during that time, all of these reproductions, both standard gauge and O gauge, were conventional and equipped with original style AC motors and E units. The Lionel Classics line featured some of the most legendary tinplate trains, such as the Green State Set, the Blue Comet, the Hiawatha, and American Flyer's Mayflower President Special. By 1993, MTH decided to become a competitor to Lionel in terms of modern O-gauge trains, thus creating the Premier line and later the Rail King line. However, MTH rejoined the pre-war reproduction market 3 years later with its Tinplate Traditions line. The first locomotive from that category was based on the design of the Lionel standard gauge 408E electric. Most of the Tinplate Traditions engines were built in two options. One is the traditional version with pre-war style motors and E-unit, while the other is the contemporary version equipped with the MTH proto-sound electronics and even smoke on steamers. And, beginning in 2000, later Tinplate reproductions also include the ability to operate with the Digital Command System, or DCS. Regardless of those differences, all the Tinplate Traditions products are packed in dark purple and black boxes. While they look very beautiful in their own ways, the only thing they lack are the Lionel and American Flyer logos, although the Ives and Dorfan reproductions have no conflict with their names in terms of license agreements. Before we get to the next chapter of MTH Tinplate, there's another Lionel product line called Prewar Celebration Series. This category is essentially the pre-war version of Lionel's post-war Celebration Series, which will be covered later in this video. Only a few O-gauge items were cataloged between 2007 and 2008. Examples include the 246E passenger set, the 269E freight set, the 291W Red Comet, the 267W Flying Yankee, and the Christmas Tinplate set. No standard gauge trains were offered in this product line. The pre-war celebration items were packed in colorful boxes decorated with a vintage catalog illustration along with the product image and features list. I'm not quite sure whether these tinplate items were manufactured by Lionel or MTH. If I have to guess, it would probably be the latter. That could be a similar experience to the aforementioned Lionel Classics line. Please feel free to let me know any more details in the comments below. In 2009, MTH introduced what was perhaps the most successful series of pre-war Lionel reproductions, the Lionel Corporation Tinplate line, or LCT for short. The company was given the license to produce these trains with Lionel and American Flyer logos on them. In its first LCT catalog that same year, MTH also announced a replica of the largest standard gauge electric locomotive ever built, the 381 SS, aka the Big Brute. The original Brute was built in Italy around 1927 as a prototype engine, but it was just too big and heavy for most consumers to handle. As a result, Lionel compressed the design into the much shorter production model called the 381E. Another noteworthy product in the 2009 Lionel Tinplate catalog is the number 200 Electric Express Type 1, which is based on the very first electric train item built by Joshua Lionel Cowan in 1901. This motorized wooden gondola was a perfect choice to kick off the newly formed LCT line, although MTH offered a similar version, Type 2, as a Tinplate Traditions product in 2003. The original Electric Express gondola was meant to be powered by batteries, but MTH was smart enough to make its replica work with any AC transformer available on the market. Unlike most other LCT engines, this one does not have protosound or DCS, only conventional control. All the MTH Tinplate products featuring Lionel logos are packed in colorful pre-war style boxes that look like this. Here's another box design for trains with American Flyer logos. In the 2010 Lionel Tinplate catalog, MTH offered the standard gauge Super 381, which to me is sort of a medium-sized version when compared to the small 381E and the big Brute. Although shorter than the Brute, this one is based on another oversized prototype that never went into production, but it still appears to be more realistic than the E variant, and it just looks beautiful. Other Lionel Tinplate products are painted in schemes based on some of the rare, uncatalogued items. For example, in the same catalog as the Super 381, MTH offered the O-Gauge Hiawatha in 2 liveries, the orange and gray colors of the Milwaukee Road, and the unusual white, maroon, and blue Archives paint. In 2011, 2 variants of the O-Gauge City of Denver Streamliners were announced, one in the yellow and brown colors of the Union Pacific, and the other in the uncatalogued 2-tone green paint. Also introduced in 2011 is another LCT train not available with command control, the number 214 armored motor car outfit, consisting of a motorized cannon car and 2 ammunition boxcars. Lionel first built this set in 1917 during World War I. The little cannon car can only operate conventionally and in only one direction, as there is simply no room for a reverse unit or any command electronics. While most of the Lionel Tinplate reproductions are intended to emulate their original counterparts, MTH has also painted some in other schemes that never existed during the pre-war era, like Lionel's signature orange and blue colors, and even some semi-prototypical railroad schemes for additional realism. I think my personal favorite example is the Lionel Girls Train, which did not exist in the pre-war period, but this reproduction gives an interesting what-if appearance. The girls' colors were featured on both the O-Gauge and standard gauge sets. In 2014, Marklin, a German company, gave MTH the license to reproduce a tinplate model of the gorgeous Leipzig station, along with its canopy platform and boundary walls. Ironically, MTH did not plan to make any reproductions of vintage Marklin locomotives or rolling stock. I wish they should have existed. After all, MTH used to offer a lot of premier O-scale European trains. Still, the Leipzig station was packed in a beautiful box with Marklin's old bicycle logo. In the 2015 LCT catalog, MTH introduced a standard gauge bay window caboose, which never existed during the pre-war era, to my knowledge. I like it though. In the same catalog is an unusual selection of 2800 series O-gauge freight cars involving a pre-war latch coupler at one end and a post-war knuckle coupler at the other. Known as the transition cars, these items allow the opportunity to mix old-style tinplate cars with more modern cars in one train. There were also several cars available with both post-war couplers in addition to the ones with pre-war couplers. Unfortunately, the 2 transition cars were cancelled, which was quite disappointing. I would have loved to use them for my own trains, so I could couple them to my post-war and modern rolling stock. I'm not gonna lie, I really love the way MTH improvises with its creativity beyond making accurate reproductions. It absolutely adds a lot of fun to the Lionel Corporation tinplate line. For those of you who are new to my YouTube channel, I do have a Lionel reproduction train set from MTH. It's the 263E Blue Comet steam engine with a quartet of 2600 series passenger cars. I did a review video of this set in 2018, so you can find it on my channel. I am sorry to say that MTH announced its very last LCT catalog about a month or two after I received my Blue Comet. This marked the expiration of the 10-year license to put Lionel logos on tinplate trains. LCT was the longest running product line involving these reproductions and had effectively outlasted the 1980s era Lionel Classics line. With his love of tinplate, the now retired Mike Wolf was very happy with the results of the relationship between the two major competitors. Lionel and MTH are not just rivals to each other, but they can also be colleagues in terms of promoting the hobby. And the Lionel Corporation tinplate line is a good example. Despite the license expiration, LCT will always be cherished by collectors. While there are currently not as many as pre-war reproductions as before, Lionel offered a special replica of the Clockwork Mickey and Minnie Mouse handcar in 2023 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Walt Disney Company. It was originally produced in 1934, and Lionel sold over 250,000 copies in an effort to stay in business during the Great Depression. Recently, MTH announced its latest rendition of the Leland Detroit monorail set, originally produced in the 1920s, so the company is still in the tinplate business. While the monorail is a Tinplate Traditions product, one version has also been painted in Lionel Line's colors. Okay, that pretty much sums up the pre-war reproductions chapter. Let's move on to the post-war era. It was 1945. World War II had ended, and for toy companies, especially Lionel and American Flyer, all the military production requirements were phased out. The post-war boom had begun. This era had a wide variety of trains and accessories: steam turbines, F3 diesels, the operating milk car, military and space rolling stock, etc. One of the most obvious differences between pre-war and post-war trains is that the latter now has the more realistic die-cast knuckle couplers instead of the latch or box couplers used on the former. Interestingly, there are at least 3 types of post-war rolling stock that retain their tinplate bodies from the previous era: the 2440 series passenger cars, the 2560 crane car, and the 3559 dump car. To my knowledge, these are the only tinplate style post-war cars equipped with knuckle couplers. I wonder if that inspired MTH to make their own pre-war reproductions with these couplers. The 1950s was the best decade for Lionel, as it was declared the largest toy company in the world. But it later lost its popularity by the next decade. 1969 was considered the final year of the post-war era, when Lionel was nearly out of business. American Flyer joined in the picture a couple of years prior. Fortunately, General Mills, a cereal giant, acquired both of these old toy train brands under its subsidiary, the Model Products Corporation, or MPC, later known as Fundimensions. As you can see, some of its early modern-era items resemble their post-war counterparts as if they came from toolings of the prior era, but a lot of them do not appear to be marketed as reproductions. So, the first definitive product line involving those vintage replicas is the Lionel Post-War Celebration Series, PWC. Launched in 1998, PWC had offered reproductions based on some of the most iconic Lionel trains since the end of the war. Locomotives, such as the F3s, Trainmasters, GG1s, and EP5s, are equipped with rail sounds and TMCC, allowing the user to run them alongside other modern engines without any compatibility issues. Some have the old-style Postwar motors and magnet traction, while others use contemporary CAN motors. However, small motorized units such as hand cars, gang cars, and industrial switchers do not have command control for the same reason as in some pre-war reissues. There is no room for such equipment. On the contrary, more recent motorized units, including speeders, trackmobiles, and tie ejectors, do indeed have TMCC on board. Like the pre-war product lines that I talked about earlier, the post-war Celebration series has its own commemorative box design printed with a brief story of its namesake era. Some post-war reproductions are also based on those that were cataloged, but never made until more recently. For example, Lionel announced the number 213 lift bridge in 1950, but it was cancelled until 2002. Good lord, that was extremely overdue for more than a half century. However, the company produced the modern version of the lift bridge, number 6-12782, in the early 90s. Other post-war style trains are in the form of archive collection, in which they are copied from uncatalogued samples, some painted in quirky schemes. Lionel continued offering the post-war Celebration products until the 2008 Volume 2 catalog, which announced a new line of reproductions for a similar purpose. Notice the cover reused from the 1952 catalog, a prominent image of post-war Lionel. The new series was called Postwar Conventional Classics, to promote the way these old trains operated back in the days before rail sounds and command control, both of which are absent on these particular reproductions. Again, there are still some old features, including Postwar motors and magnet traction, as well as electronic reverse units. Although there are no rail sounds or TMCC on any conventional classics engines, they do have digital whistles and bells. I don't think any of the steamers within that category have the traditional air whistle, but I could be wrong. Instead of using a modern-looking box design like the Celebration series would, the conventional classics are packed in the old-style boxes intended to emulate the real post-war boxes. While these products are not exactly the same as their original counterparts, they are a little bit better than PWC in terms of authenticity. Not only they function like in the old days, but the look of their boxes is also true to the post-war era. Beginning in 2012 or so, Lionel cataloged its subsequent reproductions as post-war inspired for some reason, though there are several noteworthy engines in this lineup. Examples include the Union Pacific Alco Diesel Anniversary Set from 1950, and the two Archive F3 sets, one in the Santa Fe Black Bonnet scheme, and the other in the New York Central Red Lightning Stripe scheme. The post-war inspired engines appear to have the same technical features as in the conventional classics line. And now, for our honorable mention, behold the king of Lionel history. The mighty engine of the century. The 1937 O-scale model of the New York Central 464 Hudson J1E steam locomotive. Known as the 700E, it was built by Lionel in response to the criticism from scale modelers. Up until that time, the company had focused on tinplate toy trains for kids, and many of them were painted in eye-catching colors, not to mention the fact that mothers were the predominant shoppers in those days. Unfortunately, these trains looked unrealistic and therefore unappealing to some customers who demanded more prototypical aesthetics. Irritated, Joshua Lionel Cowan decided that it was worth the time and money to make a meticulously detailed, die-cast scale model that is intended for adults rather than for kids. As indeed he did, by using his favorite engine, the Hudson. With so many rivets accurately counted, the 700E was originally priced at $75, which was a lot of money back then, especially during the Great Depression. In 1939, Lionel announced a less expensive scale locomotive, which was modeled after the Pennsylvania Railroad's 060 B6 steam switcher. It costed $35, less than half the price of the Hudson. We all know that two-rail track is naturally more realistic than three-rail track, but the Hudson was designed to run on the latter. This is a special track system called T-rail, which has a prototypical appearance compared to the traditional tubular track. In addition to the 700E and B6, Lionel introduced a semi-scale version called the 763E, along with several other die-cast steamers resembling the New York Central Hudson, but with different wheel arrangements. To celebrate its 50th anniversary in 1950, the company announced yet another Hudson, number 773. Let's jump ahead to 1989, when Lionel reissued the B6 switcher, 47 years after it was last made. This reproduction was among the first engines to feature rail sounds. As promised, Lionel brought back the 700E, also equipped with rail sounds, in honor of the company's 90th birthday in 1990. A set of 4 red streamlined passenger cars were also reissued to emulate the Rail Chief set. These tinplate coaches were manufactured by MTH under the Lionel Classics line. Meanwhile, the Postwar 773 Hudson was reproduced exclusively for Lionel's Century Club in 1996, and as a post-war celebration series freight set in 2005. A special 24-karat gold-plated version of the 700E was offered for Lionel's 100th anniversary, as well as the beginning of the new millennium in 2000. Now, forgive me if I'm a little bit off topic, but MTH announced several gold trains as part of its Millennium series. Here's a Tinplate Traditions standard gauge President Special set, a Premier O-Scale Hudson with heavyweight passenger cars, and a Rail King GG1 with streamlined cars. Interestingly, there are several unusual MTH reproduction sets combining a Premier die-cast steam engine with a tinplate style tender and tinplate cars. These hybrid trains were part of the American Legacy series. Moving ahead to 2010, the 700E became a product of Lionel's innovative Vision line, which was introduced the year before. As such, it features the whistle steam effect, where smoke blows out of a hidden hole to give the illusion of steam coming out of the whistle. Also included is the swinging bell behind the smokestack. While the 700E might not be as fully prototypical as a modern-era O-Scale Hudson, there is no denying that it's an amazing engineering accomplishment done by Joshua Lionel Cowan, and it is arguably the finest locomotive in the history of O-gauge trains. It's hard to believe that the Vision Line 700E was cataloged not too long after the 2008 Wall Street recession. Compare that to the original Hudson, which was made during the Great Depression. Thank God Lionel survived both of these economic hardships, as well as the coronavirus pandemic. Since then, There might have been rumors that Lionel is going to make its latest rendition of this engine in 2025, which is anticipated to commemorate the company's 125th anniversary. Because it is a very, very significant highlight in Lionel's history, maybe there will be another run of Vision 700Es. Who knows? And that concludes the definitive history of Toy Train Reproductions. I hope this video gives you an idea of why they are not as bad as some hobbyists think. There may still be a few purists out there who hate reproductions, but I don't care. The overall opinion will probably change from bad to good, then again, good to better. Even though I'm only in my late 20s, I absolutely love seeing reproductions just as much as originals, don't get me wrong. With that being said, if you want a real pre-war or post-war engine as a truly old model, then go find an original. If you don't care about collecting old trains, but still want vintage or glossy looks from either era, then I would recommend buying a reproduction. That also has a generally lower cost than an original in pristine condition. I personally hope that more and more scale modelers will genuinely increase their appreciation of toy train history, whether they'll be spending some money on reproductions or not. Eric Siegel, the guy I follow online, is a perfect example, because he normally prefers realistic O-scale trains, but he does enjoy running pre-war and post-war trains as well. Even standard gauge is no exception to his collection. In a nutshell, a reproduction is kind of like a reissue of a modern era train item, but on a much longer term. For instance, Lionel reintroduced the modern O-scale 442 Hiawatha steam locomotive in 2024. It was previously offered in 2006, which was 18 years ago, a relatively short time. On the other hand, the original O-gauge tinplate Hiawatha was last produced in 1941. It wasn't until 1988 when the engine and passenger cars were reissued during the Lionel Classics era. That's a total of 47 years, which is more than 2.5 times longer than the hiatus for the prototypical O-scale version. Oh, I almost forgot. Not only the trains and accessories have been reproduced over the years, but there are also the Lionel licensed reproduction boxes, manufactured in the USA by East Coast Train Parts. These days, the old empty boxes have become more valuable as much as toy trains do, and I understand why. Please visit the manufacturer's website to learn more about the Lionel Repro boxes. Alright, I'm going to end the video with my pick of the month. This is a pretty obvious choice, because for those of you who don't know, Tom McComas, founder of TM Books and Video, died on August 8th, 2024. This year is TM's 50th anniversary, and its producer has just passed away. What a heartbreaking coincidence. Tom lived up to age 86, which was a reasonably long time, so God bless him. After hearing about his death, I knew that I should mention him while making this video, simply because he produced so many shows featuring both pre-war and post-war trains, some original and some reproduced. He was the man behind one of my best childhood memories, and that is a kid series called I Love Toy Trains, most episodes of which were narrated by his son, Jeff McComas.
I'm Jeff. We have a great show for you, so let's get started. As always, we open with a song.
Did you know Tom's older son, Tom Jr., is a Hollywood stunt performer?
We did that to grab your attention.
Pretty cool guy, but Jeff is still my favorite. He really did an awesome job narrating a lot of TM videos. Until I turned 8 years old, I didn't know much about American railroads, but we discovered a couple of I Love Toy Trains VHS tapes at our local library while living in Rochester, New York. I soon fell in love with the series and eventually supplemented them with some shows that are intended for hobbyists. In fact, I wrote about my experience with TM videos on the LaRosa's Trains website. We don't know whether the company will stay in business, but hopefully there will be somebody else to become the new leader. It may be Jeff McComas or even co-producer Joe Stachler, who has worked for Tom since the mid-1990s when Jeff was much younger. I am extremely grateful for Tom's career and talent, not only as a book writer and video producer, but more importantly, as a true toy train enthusiast. He made a substantial impact on the hobby. I have so much more to say about him, but let's keep my pick of the month short. May you rest in peace, our dear Tom McComas. I've learned a lot about toy trains from your videos. You will always be loved forever and ever. If you'd like to support LaRosa's Trains, I would greatly appreciate it. That can be done through my Patreon page at patreon.com/LaRosa's Trains. Patrons will receive exclusive benefits, which are all explained directly on this page. Link in the description. Your contribution, regardless of your preferred membership, is essential not only to me, but to the future of LaRosa's Trains. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and be sure to hit the subscribe button so you can see what's coming up next from this channel. Anyway, that's all for now, and as always, thanks for watching. I'm Brian LaRosa, and I'll see you next time.